Soft piano notes drift beneath the sound of city rain. Somewhere in Manhattan, a young woman stands at the edge of a dream and a storm. Emily Carson tightens her coat, staring up at the silver tower of Stonebridge Corporation. It gleams against the gray morning sky, a world built for power, not for kindness. Tomorrow, she will walk through those glass doors as the new executive assistant to Ethan Stonebridge, a man known for brilliance, precision, and a heart colder than the marble floors beneath his feet. She tells herself it's just a job, but deep down, she knows she's stepping into something larger, a test of patience, of pride, and maybe of her own heart. Because people like Ethan don't believe in emotion, they believe in results. And people like Emily, they believe in second chances. Still, there's a quiet tremor in her chest, the kind that comes before life changes shape. Before you meet someone who makes you see yourself differently. Tonight, Manhattan hums below her window, lights flickering like questions she can't yet answer. What happens when warmth meets ice, when the one who's meant to command the world begins to lose control of his own heart? Let's begin the story. The millionaire CEO never imagined his secretary could steal his heart. The sound of heels against marble echoed softly through the grand lobby. It was early morning, but the air inside Stonebridge Corporation already carried that quiet pressure, the kind that made people speak in hushed tones and walk a little faster. Emily Carson clutched her leather folder to her chest. Her palms were slightly damp. Outside, Manhattan buzzed with taxis and steam from the subway grates. But here, everything was still, the kind of stillness that belonged to power. A man in a dark suit brushed past her, phone pressed to his ear. A woman followed, carrying a tablet, her steps precise, unhurried, like she'd practiced this dance 100 times. Emily inhaled slowly, reminding herself, "You belong here too." She walked toward the reception desk, her reflection flickering across the glass walls that seemed to stretch forever. The receptionist didn't look up at first, just said, "Name Emily Carson." She replied softly, "First day, executive assistant to Mr. Stonebridge." That name Stonebridge carried its own kind of gravity. She'd heard it countless times during business school, Ethan Stonebridge, the man who built an empire from nothing, who turned risk into gold, who expected perfection. The receptionist finally glanced up, a polite smile, but her eyes said something else. "Good luck. You'll need it. HR will take you upstairs," she said, pointing toward the elevators. As the doors closed behind Emily, her heart beat against her ribs like it was counting down to something she couldn't name. Up on the 47th floor, she was greeted by a woman in her 50s tailored suit, clipped tone. No time for nonsense. "I'm Helen Drake," she said, "head of human resources. You must be the new assistant." Emily nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Helen studied her, eyes sharp. "Mr. Stonebridge doesn't tolerate mistakes. He notices everything. Your schedule will be unpredictable, your hours long. If you can handle that, you'll learn more here than anywhere else in the city." The elevator chimed again. Helen turned toward it and added, almost as an afterthought, "And one more thing, he doesn't like small talk. So, don't try to make any." The hallway stretched ahead like a runway, glass offices, hushed conversations, the faint hum of computers. Emily followed Helen through it all, trying to absorb the rhythm of this world. Inside her chest, a quiet storm gathered, excitement tangled with fear. When they reached the final door, Helen paused. "He's expecting you." Emily's fingers tightened around her folder. She took one breath, then another, and stepped inside. The office was enormous, all clean lines and muted light. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the skyline, 1,000 buildings shimmering under the morning sun. Behind a sleek black desk sat a man she'd only ever seen in photographs. Ethan Stonebridge, tall, still, every movement deliberate, like even time waited for his approval. He was signing something when he said, without looking up, "You're late." Emily froze. It's 9 on the dot, sir." He finally looked at her, gray eyes, unreadable. 9 on the dot, he repeated quietly, checking his watch, which is 60 seconds too late for a meeting that starts at 9. She swallowed. It won't happen again. A flicker, maybe amusement, maybe something else crossed his face before vanishing. Good. Sit. She obeyed. The chair felt too soft, the silence too heavy. He asked questions fast, precise, about her previous jobs, her degree, her typing speed, her experience handling confidential documents. Every answer felt like walking a tightrope. When she mentioned her internship at a small consulting firm, he glanced up. So you've never worked with someone like me before? She hesitated. No, sir. He nodded slowly. That might be your greatest advantage. For the first time, his tone softened almost imperceptibly. He leaned back, studying her the way a sculptor studies raw marble, already imagining what it could become. You'll shadow me this week, learn the systems, the schedule, and the rules. You'll also learn when to speak and when not to. Emily nodded again, unsure if her voice would come out steady. When he dismissed her, she walked out of that office on unsteady legs, her heartbeat echoing louder than her heels. The glass hallway shimmered under the morning light, and she caught her reflection again, same brown hair, same soft eyes, but something about her face looked different now. Maybe it was the way she stood a little taller. Or maybe it was the realization that she just stepped into a world where every detail mattered, and every mistake could cost her everything. At her new desk, she placed the folder down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. She took a quiet breath. From somewhere down the corridor, she heard his voice calm, low, commanding, giving orders that seemed to make the entire floor move in sync. And for a reason she couldn't explain, that sound steadied her. Through the glass wall, the city stretched endlessly, a mix of noise, ambition, and invisible battles. Emily thought of all the people who had probably stood where she was, only to quit, to crumble, or to fade into the background. But she wasn't going to fade. She turned on her computer, opened her first task list, and began typing. Each keystroke felt like a small promise. By noon, she'd already learned the rhythm of the office, who whispered before knocking, who brought coffee at exactly 10:15, who flinched when the CEO passed by. Power had its own gravity here, and Ethan Stonebridge was its center, once, while passing his office with a stack of reports. She caught a glimpse of him at the window, hands in pockets, shoulders squared, staring out at the city as if he owned the horizon. For a brief second, his reflection overlapped with hers in the glass. 2 worlds, inches apart. He turned slightly, catching her gaze. Their eyes met, and just like that, something shifted so subtle she almost convinced herself it didn't happen. "Ms. Carson," he said, his voice level. "Good work on the expense reports." It was a small acknowledgement, barely more than a sentence. But coming from him, it felt like a door unlocking somewhere inside her. "Thank you, sir," she managed. He nodded once, then returned to his papers. The moment was over as quickly as it came, but Emily carried it with her the rest of the day, that quiet flash of warmth behind the ice. When she left the building that evening, the city lights had begun to glow. The glass tower behind her reflected the fading sky, and in that reflection, she saw herself tired, yes, but also awake in a new way. Something had begun. She couldn't name it yet, but deep down, she knew nothing in her life would ever be quite the same again. Morning light poured through the glass walls of the 47th floor, pale and clean, like the start of a test she hadn't studied for. Emily stood by her desk, arranging papers she didn't need to arrange, anything to keep her hands from trembling. Around her, the office hummed quietly, the sound of polished shoes, phones vibrating on silent, pens scratching against paper. It was the rhythm of precision, and every beat reminded her that one wrong move could shatter the illusion that she belonged here. Helen Drake's voice still echoed in her mind. "Mr. Stonebridge never forgives mistakes." Helen appeared again just after 8, heels clicking with military timing. She handed Emily a slim binder, his schedule. Every detail is time-stamped. Learn it. Live by it. Her tone left no space for misunderstanding. Emily nodded, clutching the binder like a lifeline. Helen studied her a moment longer, then said quietly, almost kindly, "He'll test you. Not to be cruel. To see if you break." Then she walked away, leaving a faint trace of perfume and pressure. The morning unfolded in a blur of instructions. Emails came faster than she could breathe. Phone lines blinked like impatient eyes. Each message began with the same 3 words, "Mr. Stonebridge needs," and ended with something that had to be done now. Emily kept her voice calm, her movements deliberate, though her pulse thudded beneath the collar of her blouse. Once, while she was reviewing a contract draft, the office door opened without warning. Ethan Stonebridge stepped out, crisp as the morning itself. "Carson," he said, just her name. It felt like both a command and a test. "Yes, sir, coffee. 2 sugars, no cream." She nodded quickly, nearly knocking over a pen. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he noticed everything. In the break room, she fumbled with the machine, burning her fingertip on the edge of the cup. The small sting grounded her. When she returned, he was at the window again, speaking on the phone, his voice low and precise. She placed the coffee on his desk without a sound. He ended the call, turned, and his eyes swept to the cup, then to her. "You remembered," he said simply. It was neither praise nor warmth, just observation. Yet the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth felt like sunlight finding its way through steel. By noon, Emily's mind was a web of appointments, codes, and names she could barely pronounce. Still, she managed, every small success a confirmed meeting. A signed form felt like a breath she'd earned, but the smallest slip would echo louder. The first came at 2 p.m. She'd scheduled a call for the wrong time zone, London, not Los Angeles. When the reminder popped up, her stomach dropped. She fixed it within minutes, but Ethan knew. Of course he knew. "Attention to detail," he said quietly, not looking up from his papers. "It's not optional here." His voice wasn't sharp, but it cut anyway. She murmured an apology and spent the next hour working in absolute silence. Outside the windows, clouds began to roll over the city, dimming the light. The skyline blurred in gray and gold, and Emily caught her reflection again in the glass. She looked smaller than she felt that morning, tired, determined, human. As the day stretched on, the office emptied. Secretaries gathered their bags, lights dimmed one by one, and the hum of conversation faded into the sound of distant thunder. Only a few stayed, the ones who, like her, didn't dare leave before he did. At 7, Helen passed by again, coat over her arm, first day and still standing. She said, half impressed, "Don't expect applause. Survival here is the applause." Then she was gone. Emily turned back to her desk, eyes blurring over spreadsheets and notes. She wanted to go home, to kick off her shoes, to breathe. But another email appeared urgent. "Mr. Stonebridge requesting quarterly summaries before morning." "No, please. No, thank you. Just expectation." Her fingers moved across the keyboard until they ached. She cross-checked figures, reformatted charts, double-checked margins. Time dissolved. When she finally printed the reports, it was past 9. She walked them into his office, heart hammering. He looked up from his laptop. The room was quieter than ever, the city glowing behind him in streaks of amber and blue. She placed the folder on his desk. "The quarterly summaries, sir." He took them, flipping through the pages with unreadable calm. Then he stopped, tapping one line with his finger. "You corrected the revenue forecast," he said. "The number my analysts missed. Yes, sir." The decimal was misplaced in the formula. It changed the projection by almost 4%. He glanced up, eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. "Good." A pause. Then softer. "Very good." Something in his tone shifted, less command, more acknowledgement. She stood there, uncertain what to do with the warmth creeping into her chest. He closed the folder, set it aside. Go home, Ms. Carson. Be here at 8 sharp. Outside. Rain had started again. She stepped into the night. Umbrella trembling in the wind, shoes clicking against wet pavement. The tower behind her shimmered, its top lost in cloud. Every window glowed like a heartbeat. She should have felt exhausted, drained, maybe even defeated. But instead, there was a quiet current running beneath her fatigue, a strange mix of fear and pride. She had made it through her first day under impossible pressure, and somewhere in that maze of rules and warnings, she'd caught the faintest glimpse of something human in him. A taxi splashed past, scattering drops that glimmered under the streetlight. Emily pulled her coat tighter, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow, you'll do better." The city didn't answer, but a low rumble of thunder rolled across the skyline as if promising she would. High above, in his office, Ethan Stonebridge stood by the same window, watching the rain trace slow lines down the glass. On his desk, her report lay open. The corrected number circled neatly in blue ink. He found himself wondering not about the numbers, but about the woman who had caught what everyone else missed. He reached for his coffee cup, now cold, and smiled faintly at the 2 sugar packets beside it. A small detail, but one he'd noticed. Down on the street, Emily disappeared into the blur of lights, unaware that her quiet diligence had already left its mark. The night settled over Manhattan, heavy and bright, and somewhere between exhaustion and hope, a door had quietly opened, one neither of them could yet see. The sound of rain lingered in the air the next morning, soft and distant, like the city itself was still waking up. Emily arrived 10 minutes early, though her nerves made it feel as if she'd been late for hours. She stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb 35, 42, 47 each ding like a heartbeat. Her reflection stared back from the mirrored wall, tidy hair, pale lips, eyes rehearsing calm. But calm wasn't what she felt. When the doors opened, the office was already alive. The steady click of keyboards, quiet footsteps across the marble floor, the faint scent of roasted coffee that never quite reached the taste buds, it all blended into one rhythm, precise and demanding. She placed her bag under the desk and adjusted her notepad, though she knew it was already aligned perfectly. The routine gave her something to hold on to. Then, a silence. Not complete, but enough to make the air heavier. A subtle shift like the moment before a conductor lifts the baton. She looked up. Ethan Stonebridge stepped out of his office, tall, composed, each movement exact, as if calculated down to the inch. The gray suit, the crisp tie, the watch that gleamed faintly beneath his cuff. Every detail spoke of discipline. But it wasn't his appearance that drew attention. It was the gravity he carried. People straightened without realizing it. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to lower its tone. He turned his gaze toward her desk. Ms. Carson. The first time he said her name, it was like a sound weighed with judgment. She stood quickly, nearly knocking her pen to the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Stonebridge." "Follow me," he said, already walking. His office felt larger today. Or maybe it was just the presence of him that filled the space. The city stretched behind the glass wall towers. Smoke, motion, but he was stillness itself. She sat only when he gestured. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped loosely. "Your reports were accurate." "Thank you, sir. But accuracy is expected, not praised." The words landed softly, yet they sliced clean. She nodded once, hiding the small sting. He glanced at the tablet on his desk. "I've read your file. Business degree, top of your class, some freelance consulting work, no family connections in the industry." "Yes, sir." His eyes lifted to hers. "Good. I don't like nepotism." For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a warning. Then came the questions. Not personal, never personal, but sharp, technical, rapid, about scheduling, crisis management, time allocation. How would you handle a conflict between client demands and internal deadlines? What's your strategy for prioritizing under pressure? When do you say no to a superior? Each question felt like walking across a wire. She answered carefully, steady but not rehearsed. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't reveal anything, only his eyes moved, assessing. When she finished, he was silent for several seconds. The city's hum filled the space between them. "You think before you speak," he said at last. "That's rare here. Keep it." She exhaled quietly, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. He rose then, walking toward the window. The sunlight cut across his shoulder, outlining him in pale gold. "You'll be managing not just my calendar, but my time." "My time," he repeated, turning slightly, "is the company's currency. Don't waste it, I understand. Do you?" His voice softened, but the question wasn't rhetorical. Emily's throat tightened. "I do, sir, completely." He studied her a moment longer, then returned to his desk. "You'll accompany me to the board meeting at 10? Take notes, don't speak, observe how decisions are made. They'll forget you're there if you're quiet. Yes, Mr. Stonebridge." He nodded, already shifting focus to the papers before him. The conversation was over. Outside, she felt her pulse in her fingertips. The air in the hallway felt cooler now, almost merciful. She returned to her desk, sat down slowly, and only then allowed herself to breathe. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Helen dropped off folders, reminding her again. He doesn't repeat himself. If you miss it once, it's gone. Emily just nodded. When the meeting began, she followed Ethan into the conference room, notebook in hand. The space gleamed with glass and chrome. Executives lined the table, men in expensive suits, women with eyes sharp as mirrors. They nodded respectfully when he entered, some smiling too quickly, others waiting to see what mood he carried today. He didn't smile back, he didn't need to. Throughout the meeting, she sat silently at the edge, recording every word, every shift in tone. Ethan's voice was calm, but firm enough to end discussions without raising it. When someone tried to argue a forecast, he countered with numbers she hadn't seen anywhere in the file. When another questioned his decision, he listened, then dismantled the argument piece by piece, polite but merciless. It was like watching precision dressed in human form. And yet, once, during a brief pause, she caught him looking at her, not with warmth, but as if checking whether she was keeping up. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. She nodded slightly, and he returned to his notes. That small exchange was nothing to anyone else, but to her, it felt like being acknowledged in a room where invisibility was survival. By the time the meeting ended, her hand ached from writing. Ethan gathered his papers, spoke briefly with two directors, then said simply, "Ms. Carson, follow." She hurried after him, heels clicking softly. Back in his office, he set down the files, summarized today's discussion, and sent it to my inbox by 6. "Yes, sir." "And Ms. Carson," he added without looking up. "Good work, keeping quiet." The corner of her mouth lifted despite herself. "Thank you, sir." He didn't respond, but when she turned to leave, she thought she saw a flicker of something almost human in his expression. Not kindness exactly, recognition, maybe. She spent the rest of the day crafting the summary, reviewing every phrase to match his tone, precise, direct, without embellishment. When she finally sent it, the sky outside was fading to gray. Minutes later, an email notification blinked on her screen. Received, accurate, efficient. 3 words. No signature. And yet, it was the first message she'd ever gotten from him. She sat back, letting the glow of the monitor fade softly over her face. Somewhere deep down, beneath the exhaustion, there was a spark of quiet pride. Maybe she'd passed the first test. Maybe he'd noticed. The office lights dimmed as she packed her things. The city below shimmered with life again. Horns, sirens, the pulse of a million strangers chasing something. Emily paused at the elevator, glancing once toward the glass doors of his office. A faint outline moved inside Ethan at his desk, still working, still unreachable. She pressed the elevator button. The doors slid open with a soft chime. As she stepped inside, a single thought followed her down. For someone so cold, she wondered, why did his silence feel warmer than most people's words? The morning began with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet shuffle of papers. Emily's desk was already covered with color-coded folders, each labeled in her tidy handwriting. Outside the window, Manhattan shimmered in pale gold, the streets below still wet from last night's rain. She had barely slept, her mind replaying yesterday's meeting. Every look, every word, every silence that had carried more weight than a sentence ever could. She straightened her blazer, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the sleeves, and told herself, today, just focus. But focus wasn't easy when the air itself seemed to vibrate with his presence. Ethan Stonebridge's office door was closed, but she could hear the faint murmur of his voice through the glass, low and even, speaking with someone on a conference call. Every now and then, there was a pause, long, deliberate, and the rhythm of his tone changed, softer, as though considering something deeply. At 8:59 sharp, his door opened. He stepped out, holding a file in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. "Ms. Carson?" She turned so quickly she nearly knocked over her pen holder. "Yes, sir." He placed the file on her desk. "Reformat this report. It's incomplete." She glanced at it, heart already racing. "Which part?" "Sir, page 7. He said, you'll see it." And then he was gone again, walking down the hall with that steady, measured stride that somehow made everyone else move faster. She opened the file immediately. Numbers, charts, notes, everything looked correct. But then she spotted a miscalculation in the forecast summary. Not hers, someone else's. Still, it was under her review now. She rolled up her sleeves, pulled out her calculator, and began to work. Minutes turned into an hour. The office filled slowly with sound, the tapping of keys, the soft rustle of jackets, the polite laughter of people pretending not to be afraid. But Emily barely heard it. She was in her own quiet storm, focused, tracing lines of data like following veins on a map. When she finished, she saved the file, printed it, and walked toward his office. Her knuckles hovered for a moment before she knocked. "Come in." His voice, calm as always. She entered, holding the folder with both hands. "I corrected the forecast, sir. It was a margin error from accounting." He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Emily hesitated, then obeyed. He flipped through the pages, eyes scanning quickly. The silence stretched thin between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he set the papers down and looked up. "You found it?" "Yes, sir." His gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. "That mistake cost us 3 hours yesterday. You caught it in 20 minutes. I just double-checked the formulas," she said quickly, trying to keep her tone even. He leaned back slightly, fingers tapping once against the table. "You did more than that." A pause. The corner of his mouth tilted just barely, but enough to soften the sharp lines of his face. "You did better than I expected." The words hit her harder than she thought they would. A quiet warmth spread through her chest, the kind that comes from being seen after trying so long to disappear. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once, returning his attention to the papers, though something about his expression had changed. The edges of his usual indifference had blurred. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Most people spend months trying to read my system. You adapted in days. That's rare." Her heart stumbled a little. "I'm just trying to learn as much as I can." He gave a quiet hum, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "Keep doing that." For a moment, the room felt still again, but not with the usual tension. There was something different, something almost human in the silence. Then the phone rang, and the moment vanished. He picked it up, his tone instantly clipped. "Professional?" Emily stood, unsure whether to leave. He gave a small nod, and that was her cue. Outside, she exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest as if to steady herself. For the rest of the day, her focus wavered every time he passed by. Her pulse skipped just slightly. He didn't speak much, only the occasional instruction, a brief glance, but each glance felt heavier than it should have. Later that afternoon, Helen stopped by her desk. "You look pale," she said. "He hasn't been too harsh, has he?" Emily smiled faintly. "No, not harsh." Helen studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Don't let him intimidate you. He respects competence. That's his language?" After Helen left, Emily thought about that respect as a language. Maybe that was what his praise had been, a rare word from a man who spoke mostly in silence. As the day faded into evening, the office slowly emptied again. Outside, the city glowed in streaks of amber and blue. She gathered her things, moving slower than usual, part of her hoping, though, she wouldn't admit it, that he might step out again before she left. At 6:45, just as she reached for her coat, his door opened. "Ms. Carson," he said. She turned, startled but composed. "Yes, sir." He held up the report she'd corrected. "Excellent work." It was just 2 words this time, but his tone carried something almost imperceptible, a faint warmth beneath the steel. His eyes met hers for a second, and in that second, she saw it a glimmer of something unguarded, something that didn't belong to the CEO everyone else feared. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Good night," he said, and closed the door. She stood there for a long moment, coat still in hand, the echo of his words lingering in her chest. The city lights reflected off the polished floor, catching the edge of her shoes. When she finally stepped into the elevator, her reflection stared back at her, same face, same tired eyes, but there was a new light in them now. Not triumph, not love, something smaller, quieter, the fragile beginning of belief. And as the elevator descended, she thought of his gaze cold, precise, yet touched by something that could almost be warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her heart tremble. Somewhere deep down, she knew that this was the moment things began to change, even if neither of them realized it yet. The rain had stopped that morning, leaving the city washed clean, glistening under a pale spring sun. Emily arrived before anyone else, as she often did now. The quiet of the office before dawn had become her sanctuary. The faint buzz of the lights, the hum of the coffee machine, the view of Manhattan still half asleep. It was the only time she could breathe before the storm of the day began. By the 3rd week, she had learned the rhythm of Ethan Stonebridge's world, meetings stacked like dominoes, decisions that could shift millions, and expectations that left no room for error. But she was beginning to move within it, steady, calm, quietly effective. She had become the silent axis around which his schedule spun. That morning, the storm came earlier than usual. A sudden alert flashed across her screen, an article spreading fast online, accusing the company of mishandling an international deal. The headline was sharp, dramatic, and dangerously misleading. She could almost hear the panic ripple through the upper floors before anyone said a word. She stood immediately, grabbed her tablet, and walked toward Ethan's office. The door was open. He was already on the phone, voice cold and composed. "Pull the numbers," he was saying. "I want the original reports by 9. He hung up just as she approached. "Sir," she said quietly, "the article's already trending." The data they quoted was from a preliminary draft, not the final release. I checked the timestamp. His eyes lifted from the desk, sharp and surprised. "You saw it." 15 minutes ago, she replied. "I've emailed the communications director with the verified data set. If we issue a correction before noon, we can control the narrative." For a moment, there was silence. Then he nodded once. "Good. Draft the statement yourself. Copy me before it goes out." She blinked. "Me? You have the details. Make it happen." Her pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. Back at her desk, she wrote, rewrote, cut, and refined until the words carried both truth and calm authority. When she sent it to him, her hands were shaking. 10 minutes later, a reply came. One line, approved, send. By afternoon, the crisis had shifted. Major outlets corrected the story. The stock stabilized. The buzz faded as quickly as it had flared. And when Ethan walked past her desk that evening, he said nothing, but his glance lingered a fraction longer than usual. A quiet victory. The next test came 2 days later. A client from Tokyo arrived unexpectedly, requesting a schedule change for an ongoing project. It would throw off the CEO's entire week board meetings, investor calls, everything. While others debated logistics, Emily was already at her screen, moving puzzle pieces, aligning times across time zones, drafting itineraries. When Ethan's assistant from finance arrived breathless with a question, she handed him a printout. Tell Mr. Stonebridge the Tokyo meeting can be shifted to Thursday at 9, with a live link to the London team. He won't miss the investor call. He stared at her like she'd just solved a riddle no one else could. That afternoon, Ethan called her into his office again. He didn't look up from his computer when he spoke. You rearranged my entire week without being told. Yes, sir. And every department agreed to it. They did. He paused, then glanced at her. You realize that's not standard procedure. She swallowed. I assumed efficiency mattered more than procedure. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then something rare, something almost like amusement passed over his expression. It does, he said quietly. The words felt like a small door opening, one she hadn't known existed. Over the next few weeks, he began asking for her opinion not often, but enough for people to notice. She sat in on high-level meetings, not to speak, but to observe. And when he turned to her suddenly one day and asked, "What do you think, Ms. Carson?" she answered honestly, heart pounding. Her answer wasn't perfect, but it was real. Afterward, when the others had left, he said simply, "You're learning faster than most." She smiled faintly, unsure if she was allowed to. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," he said, closing his notebook. "Just keep up." Still, that night, she carried those words home like a secret. But even success came with exhaustion. The long hours blurred together, the late-night emails, the missed dinners, the weekends that disappeared under piles of reports. Some nights she sat alone in her apartment, city lights flickering across her window, wondering why his approval mattered so much. It wasn't admiration, it was something quieter, deeper, more dangerous. He wasn't easy to understand. He didn't praise often. He didn't smile much. But every now and then, there was a moment, a small exchange, a shared silence that made her chest tighten. One evening, she stayed later than usual, finalizing a presentation for the morning. She was the last one left on the floor when the elevator chimed. Ethan stepped out, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked more human somehow, less unreachable. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He stopped beside her desk, glancing at the glowing monitor. "That's the investor deck." "Yes, I'm reviewing the projections before tomorrow's meeting." He leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, his scent faint but distinct coffee, cedar, and something metallic, like rain on steel. "You caught the discrepancy on page 4. I thought it might affect the final valuation," she said softly. He nodded. "It would have." "Good eye?" She turned slightly, startled by the nearness of him. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't look away. His eyes were calm, thoughtful, and in that stillness, something wordless passed between them. Then he straightened, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "Go home, Ms. Carson. You've done enough for today." Her pulse took a long time to steady after he walked away. When she finally left the building, the air outside was cool and damp. The city lights shimmered against puddles like scattered stars. She stopped for a moment under the awning, breathing in the smell of wet asphalt and spring rain. The wind brushed a strand of hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear and smiled, faintly, without knowing why. Because for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider trying to survive. She felt like she belonged here. And maybe, just maybe, he had started to see it too. Up on the 47th floor, the light in his office still burned. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city stretch beyond the glass. On his desk, her report lay open, neat handwriting, steady, deliberate. He lingered on one page, then closed it slowly. "She's good," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he turned back to the skyline, unaware that somewhere below, under the same pale moonlight, Emily whispered a quiet promise of her own. "Tomorrow, I'll prove I deserve this place." And with that thought, she stepped into the night, unaware that the days ahead would test her more deeply than she'd ever imagined. It started so subtly that Emily almost missed it. Maybe it was the way his voice softened when he said her name, or the way his gaze lingered an extra heartbeat longer when she handed him a file. Whatever it was, something in the rhythm of their days began to change quietly, almost invisibly, like a new note added to a familiar song. The office still moved with its usual precision: meetings, reports, calls, deadlines. Yet beneath it all, there was something else now, something that made her pulse quicken when she heard his footsteps approach. One morning, she was reviewing data when he came to stand behind her desk. His presence carried a weight that filled the space without sound. "Ms. Carson," he said. She looked up, startled. "Yes, sir." He pointed to the document on her screen. "You adjusted the client's proposal." "Yes. The original projection didn't account for the cost fluctuations in transport." He leaned closer, scanning the numbers. The faint scent of his cologne, something subtle, like cedar and rain, made her throat tighten. "You're right," he said after a moment. "Good catch." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. When he finally walked away, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Later that week, during a tense negotiation, the presentation froze mid-sentence. Panic flickered through the room. Executives whispered, tapping keyboards. Emily moved without thinking. She switched laptops, reconnected the network, and the slides appeared again before anyone could speak. Ethan turned toward her from across the table, one eyebrow slightly raised. A single nod. No words, but that look, calm and faintly approving, felt like more than applause. That night, as she packed her bag, she caught sight of him through the glass walls of his office. He was standing near the window, phone pressed to his ear, the city's lights washing across his face. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked when no one was watching, the power, the control beneath it. There was something quieter, lonelier, and something inside her shifted. The next morning, when she brought him coffee, she found a small change. He looked up from his desk, eyes softer than usual. "You remembered," he said. "2 sugars, no cream," she replied, smiling faintly. For a second, his mouth curved barely there, but real. "You learn quickly?" It was a simple sentence, yet it stayed with her the entire day, echoing between emails and phone calls, threading through her focus like a quiet melody. In the weeks that followed, those small moments multiplied. A glance during a meeting, the faintest trace of a smile when their hands brushed while passing a document, words that weren't tender, but warmer than they should have been. Once, while they reviewed a contract late in the evening, the office mostly dark except for the city's reflection on the glass, she noticed how the light caught the silver in his hair. He was explaining something terms, percentages, but she wasn't hearing the words anymore. Only the sound of his voice. Calm, steady. Familiar now in a way that frightened her. She looked down at her notes quickly. "I'll finalize the document tonight, sir. Don't stay too late," he said. "You've done enough for one day." His tone was gentler than usual, and it startled her. "I don't mind," she said quietly. He looked at her, then really looked, and in his eyes, for a fleeting second, there was something unspoken, understanding, maybe, or recognition. The kind that passes between two people who've both learned to hide their loneliness behind composure. He nodded once, almost reluctantly. All right. When he left, the air in the room felt different, as if it still held the warmth of his presence. She sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, her mind miles away. It was after midnight when she finally stepped outside. The city had quieted, the rain returning in a light mist. She stood under her umbrella, watching the reflections of streetlights ripple across puddles. She told herself it was exhaustion making her heart ache like this, that the flutter in her chest when he spoke was nothing more than respect or admiration for a man who demanded excellence. But she knew better. Back at her apartment, she tried to sleep. The clock ticked softly in the dark. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his steady gaze, that rare, fleeting smile. She turned over, pulled the blanket closer. "Don't do this," she whispered into the silence. "He's your boss. Nothing more." Yet, even as she told herself that, her heart betrayed her with its quiet, steady rhythm, like it had already made a choice her mind wasn't ready to face. The next day, Ethan seemed more distant, as if sensing the shift and retreating behind the safety of professionalism. Meetings came and went. His voice was clipped, precise. His eyes didn't linger. But late that afternoon, when a sudden spring storm darkened the sky, he stopped by her desk on his way out. "You'll get caught in the rain if you leave now," he said. She blinked, surprised. "I have an umbrella." He hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Good." His tone softened. "Drive safe." And then he was gone, the elevator doors closing between them. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was only a simple kindness, but it felt like more a quiet note in a language she didn't yet understand. That night, she stood by her window, watching the rain blur the city lights, her reflection faint against the glass. Somewhere above, in one of those towers, she imagined him doing the same, thinking of numbers, of meetings, of things that didn't include her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible now connected them. A thread so fine, it could snap with a single wrong move. And as she whispered a quiet goodnight to no one in particular, she wondered when did her heart start waiting for his voice. The city hummed softly beneath the rain. The lights of Stonebridge Tower shimmered through the mist like distant stars. And in that silence, between logic and longing, Emily knew something had already changed, even if neither of them dared to name it. The ballroom glowed like liquid gold that evening, every chandelier shimmering with quiet opulence. Soft music drifted through the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and crystal glasses. It was the annual Stonebridge Foundation Gala, a night of elegance, charity, and unspoken power. Emily stood near the edge of the room, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. The navy blue dress she wore wasn't extravagant, but it was the kind of simple that drew the eye precisely because it didn't try to. The fabric caught the light when she moved, rippling like water. For once, she wasn't behind a desk or holding a tablet, just a woman, quietly out of place in a room full of people who lived in headlines. She told herself she was here as part of her job, handling the guest list, coordinating the media, making sure everything ran smoothly. But as the night unfolded, she realized she'd never felt more visible. Across the room, Ethan Stonebridge stood surrounded by donors and executives. His black tuxedo fit him perfectly, every line immaculate, his posture unmistakable. Yet, even among the glitter and noise, he stood apart, calm, composed, the axis of every conversation. Emily tried not to look at him, but her gaze found him anyway, again and again. Then, as if he'd felt it, his eyes met hers. It was only for a second, but in that second, the noise of the room seemed to fade. He excused himself from the small crowd and began walking toward her. Each step was steady, deliberate. Her heartbeat stumbled. She wanted to turn away, to look busy, to do anything but stand there waiting, yet she couldn't move. When he reached her, he said simply, "You clean up well, Ms. Carson." Her lips curved, unsure whether to smile or stay professional. "Thank you, sir. The event looks incredible. Congratulations." He nodded slightly, his gaze tracing her face as if seeing her for the first time outside fluorescent lights and spreadsheets. "You did most of it. I just organized," she murmured. "That's more than most people here could manage." The compliment caught her off guard. She looked down, trying to hide the warmth rising to her cheeks. "I was only doing my job." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement. Maybe admiration. Then he offered his hand. "Would you dance?" Her breath caught. Dance. Yes. His tone was calm, but his eyes held that quiet insistence she knew so well. One song, before she could overthink, she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, firm, steady. He led her to the center of the ballroom, just as a slow melody began to play, something soft and old, carried by strings and piano. They moved together almost carefully at first, like neither quite trusted the moment. His hand rested lightly at her waist, her fingers on his shoulder. She could feel the measured rhythm of his breath, the faint scent of his cologne, the strength beneath the stillness. "You seem nervous," he said softly. "I don't usually dance at work events." "This isn't work," he said. "Not tonight." The words made her heart tremble. They swayed in silence for a while, surrounded by the hum of voices and the glow of chandeliers. He moved with surprising grace, precise, like everything else he did, yet somehow gentle. The world narrowed to the quiet between them, the sound of music, the nearness of him. When she dared to look up, he was already watching her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something unguarded. "You're full of surprises," he murmured. "So are you," she said before she could stop herself. He smiled then, a small, fleeting curve of his lips that made her chest ache. The song changed, but neither of them noticed. He leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I didn't expect this," he said. She frowned softly. "Expect what?" "That someone like you," he paused, choosing the words carefully, "could make me feel this much." Her breath caught. The room seemed to tilt, every sound blurring into the distance. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. His words weren't a confession, not really, but they hung in the air between them, fragile and electric. For a heartbeat. She thought he might say more. But then the applause broke out for the next performance, and the spell shattered. He stepped back slightly, his composure returning like a mask. "Thank you for the dance, Ms. Carson," he said quietly. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "Of course." He gave a polite smile, the kind meant for the public, and turned to greet another guest. Emily stood still for a moment, the echo of his voice still in her chest. Then she stepped away from the dance floor, out of the spotlight, into the soft dimness near the balcony doors. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly, streets glittering like veins of gold, the Hudson shimmering in the distance. She pressed a hand against the cool glass, trying to steady the rush of feeling inside her. She shouldn't have let him say that. She shouldn't have let herself listen. And yet, part of her couldn't stop replaying it. "I didn't expect someone like you could make me feel this much." The words lingered, quiet and dangerous. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the music and the scent of roses from the nearby tables. Behind her, laughter rippled, glasses clinked. The night continued as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. Something had shifted again, subtle, irreversible. When she finally turned back toward the ballroom, Ethan was already across the room, surrounded by people, smiling that effortless, distant smile. Yet, when their eyes met for the briefest second, it was there again, the faint warmth beneath the surface, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were both pretending not to feel what had already begun. Emily looked away first, but her heart didn't listen. And as the music swelled, the city lights glittered beyond the glass. She realized she would never forget this night, not because of the dance, but because for the first time, she'd seen the man behind the name, and he had looked at her as if she were no longer invisible. The orchestra shifted to a brighter tune, laughter rising once more. She stood there quietly, her hand still tingling from where his had held it, and in that fleeting, fragile calm, she understood nothing about her world would ever feel the same again. The gala lights still shimmered in Emily's memory the next morning, soft and golden, like a dream she couldn't quite let go of. The echo of his words, "I didn't expect someone like you could make me feel this much," lingered somewhere deep inside, warm and fragile. But the morning after, dreams often brought reality, and reality had a way of cooling the air. By 9, the office was alive again with motion. Phones rang, shoes clicked against marble floors. The world reset to its rhythm of power and precision. Emily arrived early as usual, calm on the outside, but still replaying the way his hand had felt against hers when they danced. She'd barely settled when Helen appeared at her desk. "Busy day ahead," Helen said briskly. "Mr. Stonebridge has a meeting at 10 with an investor. A guest will be joining." Emily nodded, understood. But Helen's tone had a faint edge to it, something unreadable. "You might want to look sharp today," she added before walking away. At 10 sharp. Emily followed Ethan into the conference room. The usual group was there, board members, advisors, familiar faces, and one unfamiliar one. The woman who entered a moment later seemed to pull the light toward her. Madison Vale. Emily had heard the name before. A successful entrepreneur, philanthropist. And if the gossip was true, Ethan Stonebridge's former fiancée, she was stunning in that effortless, intimidating way of women who knew their worth too well. Dark red dress, tailored to perfection, hair like silk, confidence radiating from every step. "Ethan," Madison greeted, her voice smooth as polished glass. "Madison," he replied, standing to shake her hand. "It's been a while. Too long," she said, her eyes glinting. "You look unchanged. Still all business?" Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of polite smile he reserved for the public. "And you still make an entrance?" The air between them was charged, but not tender. More like two currents meeting, familiar, powerful, and dangerous. Emily stayed at her post near the projector, taking notes, pretending not to listen. But every word felt sharper than it should. When Madison finally turned her gaze toward her, Emily felt it like a touch. "And who's this Emily Carson?" Ethan said evenly. "My executive assistant." Madison smiled, slow, deliberate. "Of course. I've read about your promotion structure. You do like finding potential in unexpected places, don't you?" The room went quiet for a fraction of a second. Emily met her gaze with as much calm as she could gather. "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Vale." "Likewise," Madison said, though the word didn't sound like it meant what it should. Then she turned back to Ethan, dismissing Emily with the smallest flick of her eyes. The meeting began. Madison spoke eloquently, commanding attention, her words weaving numbers and charm together. Ethan listened, asked precise questions, his tone courteous but distant. Emily watched them both, her pen gliding across paper, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere toward how easily they fit into the same world, how perfect they looked across that table, matching energy and confidence. At one point, Madison laughed a low, melodic sound and placed a hand lightly on Ethan's arm. It wasn't bold, but it was familiar. Too familiar. Something inside Emily tightened. She looked down quickly, focusing on the notepad until the meeting ended. When it was over, Madison stood and adjusted her purse. "Always a pleasure doing business with you, Ethan," she said. Then, with a glance toward Emily, "And you have quite the capable team. She must be very devoted." Ethan didn't respond, just nodded. "Good day, Madison." After she left, silence filled the room like an echo. Ethan gathered his papers, his face unreadable. Emily waited for instructions, pretending not to feel the unspoken questions pressing against her chest. "Cancel my next call," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." He paused at the door, then glanced at her. "You did well today." "Thank you." She nodded, but her voice barely came out. "Of course." When he left, she sank into the chair, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't want to name. That afternoon dragged like winter. Every time she caught her reflection in the glass, she saw the same thing: composure, professionalism, the perfect assistant. But beneath it was a quiet ache she couldn't shake. She stayed late again, finishing reports, when the sound of heels echoed down the hallway. Madison appeared, coat draped over her arm, smiling like they were old friends. "Working late?" Miss Carson Emily straightened. "Just finishing some reports." "How diligent." Madison walked closer, her tone light but edged with something sharp. "I remember those days working late for Ethan, doing whatever it took to keep up." Emily's hands froze on the keyboard. "I'm just doing my job. Ms. Vale." Madison tilted her head, eyes studying her. "Oh, I'm sure you are." Then, softer. "Be careful, dear. He has a way of making people think they're special, until they remember he never lets anyone too close." Her smile was sweet and cruel at once. "Good night." And then she was gone, the sound of her heels fading down the marble corridor. Emily sat there long after, the weight of Madison's words pressing against her chest. She wanted to brush it off, to tell herself it didn't matter, but something about the way Ethan had looked at Madison, steady, familiar, unreadable, had stirred a fear she didn't want to admit. Later, when she finally left the building, the night air felt colder than usual. The city was alive, but she felt oddly alone among the lights. She stopped at the crosswalk, watching the reflections shimmer on the wet pavement, and thought about the way Madison had said his name, soft, confident, as if she still owned a piece of his past. Maybe she did. At that thought, Emily's chest tightened again. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had no right to feel anything at all. But her heart had already betrayed her, long before Madison Vale ever stepped into that room. Up on the 47th floor, the last light in the building still glowed in Ethan's office. He stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of whiskey. The city stretched before him, distant, endless. Somewhere in the reflection, he thought he saw the faint outline of Emily walking down the street, small against the sea of lights. His jaw tightened. He told himself it was just concern for his employee. Just that. But the lie didn't settle easily, and as the city exhaled below him, the faint echo of Madison's laughter lingered in his mind, mixing with the quiet memory of a navy blue dress and a pair of eyes that had looked at him like no one ever had. The next few days felt colder, not just in weather, but in the air around her. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you couldn't quite name, only sense. Ethan's voice had lost its warmth, that quiet tone that used to make her chest tighten without reason. His eyes no longer lingered when he spoke to her. Every exchange was brief, professional, perfectly polite, like nothing had ever existed beyond those boundaries. The distance was invisible but heavy, like a pane of glass between them. Emily tried to convince herself it was work deadlines, pressure, the aftershock of the gala. But the silence between them wasn't the silence of focus. It was restraint. She noticed it in small things. The way he passed her a file without looking up. The way his thank you came, clipped, almost mechanical. Even the small nods that used to mean, "I see you," had vanished. And the worst part, he was good at it. He'd built his life on control. Pulling away was effortless for him. For her, it wasn't. By the third day, she'd stopped trying to meet his eyes. It hurt too much when he didn't meet hers back. On Friday, the office was unusually quiet. Most of the team had left early for the weekend. Emily stayed behind, pretending to organize reports she'd already finished. She told herself she'd wait until he left before heading out. She didn't want the awkwardness of a goodbye that meant nothing. But as she reached for her coat, his voice came from behind. "Ms. Carson." Her hand froze. She turned slowly. Ethan stood near his office door, coat in hand, expression unreadable. "I'll need the quarterly review first thing Monday." "Of course," she said softly. "I'll have it ready." He nodded, almost absently. "Good night." "Good night, sir." That was it. No pause, no glance, just the soft sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. When the elevator doors closed behind him, the silence in the office deepened. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She sat for a moment, staring at the space where he'd been. It shouldn't have hurt this much, but it did. She gathered her things and stepped out into the chill of Manhattan night. The sky was low and gray, streetlights glinting off puddles on the pavement. Her heels clicked softly as she walked toward the small cafe around the corner, a place she went sometimes when the world felt too heavy. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and cinnamon, and sitting in the corner, waving her over, was Ryan Blake. Ryan had joined the company a year before her. Sharp mind, quick humor, kind eyes. He was one of the few people who made the office feel less mechanical. "You look like you've had a week," he said as she slid into the booth. She smiled faintly. "That obvious, only to someone who knows you, keep everything inside until it spills over." He pushed a cup toward her. "Hot chocolate. You always order that when you're trying to think your way out of something." She laughed softly, wrapping her hands around the mug. "You remember everything?" He shrugged. "It's not hard. You're kind of unforgettable when you're trying to hide something." The warmth of the drink helped loosen the knot in her chest. But when he asked, "So, what happened?" she hesitated. "Nothing," she said at first. "I mean, nothing really happened." Ryan tilted his head. "That's a strange way to say something did." She sighed. "It's Ethan. He's been different, cold, distant." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "And that bothers you?" "It shouldn't," she said quickly. "He's my boss. I shouldn't care, but you do." She looked down, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. "I don't even know when it started. Ryan?" It's not like he said anything, or did anything. Just, there were moments, small ones. And I thought she stopped, her voice breaking slightly. I thought maybe he felt it too. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said gently, "Maybe he did." She looked up, startled. "But you need to understand something about men like him." He continued. "People who build walls that high, they can look at you like you're the only person in the room and still keep the door locked, because they're terrified of what happens if they open it." Emily swallowed. "So, what am I supposed to do? Don't wait outside that door forever." His words settled deep, the way truth often did, quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. He smiled then, soft but a little sad. "You deserve someone who doesn't make you guess." The cafe noise faded into a blur around them. Emily stared at her reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind her, blurring her outline. For the first time, she didn't look like the confident assistant who could handle anything. She just looked tired. They talked a little longer about work, about plans, about nothing that really mattered. When she finally left, the wind had picked up, tugging gently at her coat. She pulled it tighter and walked slowly back toward her apartment. Above her, the skyscrapers loomed, their lights like silent eyes watching the restless city below. Somewhere up there, she knew, Ethan was probably still awake reading, working, pretending none of this existed. She wondered if he thought about her at all. And then she caught herself, because wondering hurt. When she reached her building, she paused by the steps, looking out over the city. The air smelled like rain again, the kind that comes before something breaks open. Ryan's words echoed softly in her mind. "Don't love someone who stands between reason and feeling." She exhaled slowly, the breath trembling on the way out. "Too late," she whispered. Up on the 47th floor of Stonebridge Tower, the light in Ethan's office still burned. He stood by the window, staring down at the city without really seeing it. The glass reflected his own face back at him, composed, empty, untouchable. And yet, beneath the calm, there was a weight he couldn't name, the memory of a navy blue dress, the warmth of a hand that had fit too perfectly in his. He closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. Then he turned off the light. The city below swallowed the darkness, and the distance between them grew a little wider. But even in that silence, neither of them could quite let go. The ocean smelled like salt and wind when they landed in San Diego. The late afternoon light spilled gold over the harbor, the kind that made the whole sky look softer. It was supposed to be just another business trip meetings, contracts, polite handshakes, but from the moment Emily saw the Pacific stretching wide and endless, she knew this one would feel different. She hadn't been alone with Ethan since the gala. In the office, he'd been distant again, all edges and silence. Yet here, far from the glass walls of Manhattan, something about him seemed less guarded. Maybe it was the air, or the sound of the waves just beyond the hotel. That first day was a blur of schedules. Emily followed him through conference rooms and investor luncheons, keeping pace, keeping her voice steady. By the time they finished dinner with the board, her feet ached, her mind buzzing. But when Ethan suggested a short walk before calling it a night, she found herself nodding before she even thought to hesitate. The marina was quiet, lit by a string of small white lights that traced the edge of the docks. Boats swayed gently in the water, their reflections trembling. The air was cool, brushed with the scent of the sea. They walked side by side, without speaking for a while. Their footsteps echoed softly against the wooden boards. "You handled the investors well today," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "That's my job, isn't it?" He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "You make it sound simple. It isn't." Silence again, the good kind, the kind that fills rather than empties. After a while, she said quietly, "You've been different lately." He stopped walking. "Different how?" She turned toward him, the lights catching in her hair. Colder, distant. She hesitated. "I thought maybe I did something wrong." His jaw tightened. "You didn't." "Then why?" "Because I can't seem to stop thinking about you." The words landed softly, almost lost in the sound of the waves. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined them, but he was looking at her, really looking, and she saw the truth in his eyes. He exhaled, a quiet, uneven breath. "It's easier to keep my distance than to admit that." Her heartbeat stumbled. "Ethan!" He shook his head, almost as if scolding himself. "This shouldn't be happening. You work for me. I shouldn't." She took a step closer. "You shouldn't." What his eyes flickered, torn between reason and something deeper. The wind shifted, carrying a strand of her hair against his face. He reached up, almost instinctively, to tuck it behind her ear. His hand lingered. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then, softly, he said it again, as if confessing to himself, "I can't stop thinking about you." And before she could answer, he leaned in. The kiss was slow, careful, like they were both afraid the world might end if they moved too fast. It wasn't the kind of kiss that came with fireworks. It was quieter, trembling, full of things they hadn't said for months. Her hands found the edge of his jacket, holding on as if to steady herself. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "This is insane," he whispered. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a breath. "But it feels real." He closed his eyes. "That's what scares me." The night seemed to hold still around them. The hum of the harbor, the clink of a boat against its dock, the soft rustle of the tide, it all blurred into something distant. For the first time, Ethan Stonebridge, the man who ruled every room he entered, looked uncertain, vulnerable, even. Emily felt it too, the fear beneath the warmth, the knowledge that this moment could change everything. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to step back. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I don't expect anything from you." He opened his eyes, searching hers. "You should." The words hung between them, heavy with meanings neither dared unpack. He took a small step away then, running a hand through his hair, trying to rebuild the wall he'd just let fall. "We should head back." She nodded, though her voice caught. "Of course." They walked in silence again. But it wasn't the same as before. The distance between them wasn't cold. Now it was charged, fragile, alive. At the hotel entrance, he paused. The lobby lights cast a soft glow over his face. "Good night, Emily." She met his eyes one last time. "Good night, Ethan." Then she turned, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the elevator. She didn't look back, but she felt his gaze follow her until the doors closed. Inside her room, she stood by the window, watching the dark waves roll toward the shore. Her heart still raced, her lips still tingled from the memory of him. She pressed her hand against the glass, the cool surface grounding her. Somewhere between right and wrong, logic and longing, she'd crossed an invisible line, and she didn't know if she could ever go back. Downstairs, Ethan lingered in the quiet lobby, staring out at the sea. His reflection stared back composed, professional, untouched, but he didn't believe it anymore. He'd spent his whole life mastering control, and with one kiss, she'd unraveled it all. Outside, the harbor lights flickered like scattered stars. The tide kept moving, endless and certain. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure whether what he felt was a mistake or the only thing that had ever felt right. The sound of the ocean whispered against the windows, soft, rhythmic, unrelenting. And in that quiet between them, something fragile and irreversible had begun. The morning after their return from San Diego was sharp and gray, the kind of day when New York felt more like stone than city. The sunlight barely reached the marble lobby of Stonebridge Tower, and the air inside the building seemed unusually still. Emily arrived early, as always, her mind still tangled with memories she couldn't let herself replay his voice by the harbor, the taste of salt in the air, the weight of what they'd done and what it meant. She told herself to focus, to be invisible again, to do her job as if nothing had changed. But when the elevator opened on the top floor, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The quiet hum of the office had shifted, heavier somehow. Then she saw her Margaret Stonebridge. She was standing near the window of the executive lounge, tall and poised, dressed in soft gray silk and pearls that caught the light like frost. Her presence filled the space the way power always did, quietly, completely. Even without introduction, Emily would have known exactly who she was. "Mrs." Stonebridge turned as Emily approached. Her smile was polite, practiced, the kind of smile that had probably been used to welcome senators and dismiss waiters in the same breath. "You must be Ms. Carson," she said, her tone smooth as glass. Emily nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Stonebridge. It's an honor to meet you." The woman's gaze traveled over her simple blouse, her worn leather notebook, her hands clasped a little too tightly. "I've heard you're quite indispensable to my son's daily operations." "I just try to make his work easier," Emily said carefully. Margaret smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. How thoughtful. The silence that followed was almost delicate. Then she stepped closer. "You've been with him for how long now?" "Almost a year." "That's impressive." Her voice softened, but her eyes did not. "Ethan doesn't usually keep people around that long. He demands a certain precision and restraint." Emily swallowed, sensing where this was going, but too respectful to interrupt. Margaret continued, her tone gentle but deliberate. "I imagine working so closely with him must be challenging, especially for someone your age." "It's a privilege," Emily said quietly. Margaret's smile curved again, this time just a shade too sharp. "Of course, though I do wonder if you fully understand the boundaries that come with proximity. You see, Ms. Carson, the world my son lives in is built on scrutiny. Every move he makes is watched, every decision dissected." Her eyes met Emily's, calm and cold. "And the people near him, particularly women, are often mistaken for something they're not." Emily stood very still. The words weren't loud, but they landed like stones. "I'm sure you mean well," Margaret said, voice like silk pulled too tight. "But Ethan's future is complicated. He will marry one day, and that position beside him publicly. Privately requires someone who understands what that world demands. Emily's throat ached. Mrs. Stonebridge, I assure you, you don't have to assure me of anything. Margaret cut in softly. I'm only here because I've seen this story before. A young woman, bright, loyal, hopeful, thinking kindness or intelligence can change a man like Ethan. But my son was raised to lead, not to feel. The words hung there, heavy and cruel in their calmness. For a long moment, Emily said nothing. Her fingers trembled slightly against her notebook, but her voice stayed steady when she finally spoke. I don't want anything from him, ma'am. Margaret tilted her head, studying her. No, that would be wise. The elevator doors opened behind them then, and Ethan stepped out. He froze for half a second when he saw his mother and Emily together. Mother, he said evenly. Margaret turned, her face immediately transforming into gentle warmth. Ethan, darling. He crossed the room, his expression controlled. You didn't mention you were coming by? I wanted to surprise you, she said lightly, touching his arm. You work too much. Then, after a brief glance toward Emily, she added, and perhaps trust too easily. Emily looked down, her heart beating too fast. Ethan's jaw tightened. Mother, I'll see myself out, she interrupted gracefully. You two have work to do. She smiled one last time at Emily, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The silence she left behind was suffocating. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning toward Emily. I'm sorry about that. There's no need, she said quickly. She was polite. Polite, he repeated, almost bitterly. Emily tried to smile, but her voice wavered. She's protective. I understand. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. She had no right to speak to you like that. She didn't say anything untrue. He frowned. Emily, Ethan, please. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Don't make this harder. She's your mother, and she's right about one thing. The world you live in isn't built for people like me. He started to protest, but she shook her head. It's okay. Really. You don't have to say anything. For a long moment, neither spoke. The office lights hummed softly overhead. Then Ethan said quietly, She doesn't define my choices. Emily gave a small, fragile smile. Maybe not, but she knows how to remind people where they stand. He reached out, as if to touch her hand, but stopped halfway. I won't let her hurt you. The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. She took a step back, creating space she didn't want but knew she needed. You can't protect me from perception. Ethan, and you shouldn't have to. He looked at her, something helpless in his eyes, something she'd never seen there before. Emily. She straightened her shoulders, her voice barely a whisper. It's fine. I'll get the Anderson proposal ready for the meeting. He watched her walk away, the sound of her heels fading into the hallway, leaving him standing in the quiet aftermath of his mother's warning and his own silence. Outside, the sky had turned silver with rain. Emily stood by the window, watching the drops trace lines down the glass. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the faint echo of Margaret Stonebridge's words, sharp, deliberate, unforgettable. The position beside him isn't for someone like you. The thought stung, not because it was cruel, but because a part of her feared it might be true. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet. Then, softly, she whispered to no one. Maybe she's right, but even as she said it, her heart refused to believe it. The city was wrapped in mist that morning, the kind that made even glass towers look softer. Emily arrived early, hoping the quiet would give her a moment to breathe. But the silence in Ethan's office wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the pause before a confession. He was already there, standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the skyline as if searching for answers in the fog. When she entered, he turned, and in that instant, she knew something inside him had already changed. Closed the door, he said quietly. She obeyed, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. For a moment, neither spoke. The faint hum of the city below was the only sound between them. Then Ethan exhaled, slow and tired. We need to talk. Emily's hands tightened around the folder she carried. About what? He met her gaze, his voice low, steady, and far too calm. About us. The words hung in the air, soft, dangerous, necessary. He motioned for her to sit, but she didn't. If this is about your mother, it's not. He cut in. At least not only about her. He ran a hand over his jaw, the movement weary. I've been trying to think clearly, to be rational, but the truth is, this. He paused, gesturing between them. It's not just personal, it's dangerous. Her chest tightened. Dangerous. He nodded slowly. If word ever got out about us, it could destroy everything. The board, the investors, the press. They'd turn it into a scandal before we could even speak. She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. So, that's what I am. A potential headline. Don't, he said, his voice breaking just slightly. You know that's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? Ethan, she whispered. He hesitated. His silence was worse than anger. It was the sound of him retreating behind walls she thought she'd broken through. We have contracts worth hundreds of millions pending. The media's already circling after the San Diego deal. If they find out I'm involved with my executive assistant, they'll say it's favoritism, that I've lost control. She stared at him, the air leaving her lungs like a slow collapse. Lost control. He looked up, eyes filled with something close to guilt. I built this company on precision. Emily, on discipline. People trust Stonebridge because I don't mix emotion with judgment. One rumor could destroy that trust. She swallowed, forcing the lump in her throat down. And what about trust between us? He closed his eyes. That's what makes this so hard. For a moment, she didn't move. She could still remember the way he'd looked at her by the harbor. Open, vulnerable, human. That version of him seemed like another person now, lost behind glass. She took a step closer. You told me you couldn't stop thinking about me. I can't, he admitted, his voice raw. That's the problem. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. So, you'd rather erase it. Pretend it never happened. I'd rather protect you. From what? From your own choices. His silence was answer enough. Something inside her cracked not loudly, but cleanly, like porcelain under pressure. You can't protect me by pretending I don't matter. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the man behind the title, not the CEO, not the power, just Ethan, trapped between duty and desire. You matter too much, he said quietly. That's why I'm trying to do this right. She shook her head. Right for who? For them or for you? The question hung there, trembling. He turned back to the window, his reflection fractured by the morning light. I don't know anymore. They stood in silence, the distance between them deeper than any room could hold. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, steady, but laced with something broken. You built your life around control, Ethan, but love doesn't follow rules. It doesn't wait for permission. He didn't move. I'm not asking you to risk your company, she continued, her throat tightening. I'm asking you not to lie to yourself. For a moment, he almost turned toward her. Almost. Then he said the thing that hurt more than silence. Maybe we both need to remember who we are. The words hit harder than he meant them to. Emily nodded slowly, holding herself upright even as her heart faltered. You're right, she whispered. You're the man who built Stonebridge, and I'm the woman who should have known better. She gathered the folder from the desk and started toward the door. Her steps were quiet, careful, like walking through a dream she didn't want to wake from. Emily, he called after her. She stopped but didn't turn. His voice dropped to something softer, regretful. I never wanted to hurt you. She closed her eyes. You didn't. You just reminded me where I stand. And then she left. The door closing behind her with a sound too final to be casual. Ethan stayed where he was, the city stretching endlessly below him. The reflection in the glass stared back a man with everything to lose, and yet, somehow, already losing the only thing that mattered. Downstairs, Emily walked out into the sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. The warmth hit her skin, but it didn't reach inside. She paused by the revolving doors, looking up at the gleaming name etched on the building's front, Stonebridge Corporation. Solid, unshakable, built on everything she wasn't. Her breath caught, somewhere behind those windows. The man she loved was still standing still, torn between what the world expected of him and what his heart had already chosen. And as she stepped out into the crowd, swallowed by the noise of the city, she realized something quietly painful. Sometimes love doesn't break because it ends. Sometimes it breaks because it stays. She didn't look back, but if she had, she might have seen him there, still watching, still frozen, still trying to convince himself that sacrifice and love could ever mean the same thing. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, like rumors always do. 3 days after their conversation, whispers began circling through the upper floors of Stonebridge Tower. At first, Emily ignored them. She buried herself in work, typing late into the night, convincing herself that distance was strength. But by Thursday, even the interns were talking. A photo had surfaced online, Ethan Stonebridge at a private dinner in Midtown. Across the table, smiling in flawless red, was Madison Vale. The caption was simple: Stonebridge and Vale power, couple reunited. Emily stared at the screen, her pulse slowing until she couldn't feel it at all. It was just a photo business, probably. It had to be. Yet the way Madison leaned forward, the way Ethan's gaze softened mid-laugh, it didn't look like strategy. It looked like memory. Her phone buzzed. Ryan's message flashed, "You okay? Ignore the noise." You know how people talk? But she couldn't. By noon, the gossip had evolved into certainty. Gavin Hale, Ethan's longtime rival and Madison's old associate, had given a quote to a financial magazine. "I'm glad to see Ethan finally reconciling with people who understand his world." It was meant to sound professional, but everyone knew what it implied. In the cafeteria, 2 junior analysts whispered, not realizing Emily was behind them. "She must be humiliated," one said. "Come on, did she really think she had a chance? He's Stonebridge? He doesn't date his staff." The words landed like shards. Emily turned before they could see her face. Back at her desk, she tried to focus on spreadsheets, on numbers that didn't care about hearts or headlines. But the noise inside her head was louder than the office. "He told me he couldn't stop thinking about me." The memory played like a cruel echo. So, what changed? She didn't want to confront him. Not yet. But when he walked into the conference room later that afternoon, tall, composed, every inch the man she'd fallen for, she couldn't help but look. His expression gave nothing away. No warmth, no guilt, just the polished calm of someone who'd mastered the art of pretending. During the meeting, she caught snippets talk of partnerships, mergers, a possible joint venture with Vale Holdings. Each word chipped away a little more of what she'd been trying to protect. When the meeting ended, Ethan stopped by her desk. "Ms. Carson, I'll need the Hale proposal draft by morning." Her voice was barely steady. "Yes, sir." He started to walk away, then paused. "Are you all right?" The question almost broke her. She wanted to say no. She wanted to ask him why. But all she managed was, "I'm fine." He studied her for a moment, his eyes flickering with something remorse. Maybe, but then he nodded and left. That night, she didn't go home. She sat in the office long after everyone else had gone, staring out at the city lights. The reflection in the glass looked like someone else, someone smaller, someone foolish. When she finally gathered her things, she found Ryan waiting by the elevator. "You heard?" he said gently. She nodded. "It's everywhere." Ryan sighed. I know what it looks like, but you don't know the whole story. She met his eyes, tired and hollow. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe the story's the same as it always is. People like me don't belong in worlds like his. Don't say that. It's true, she whispered. He belongs to them. The board, the name, the empire. I was just temporary. Ryan took a slow breath, searching for words that might help but finding none. Gavin's behind this, he said finally. He's been trying to destabilize Stonebridge for years. If he can make investors doubt Ethan, even personally, he wins. Emily looked away. Then I guess I'm just the perfect pawn, aren't I? The bitterness in her voice startled even her. She'd never sounded that cold before. When she reached her apartment that night, the silence felt different, heavier, lonelier. She poured a glass of water, but her hands shook too much to drink it. The news was everywhere now. Ethan Stonebridge and Madison Vale seen discussing merger terms over dinner. She turned off her phone, but in the dark, her mind wouldn't stop. She remembered his hand in hers at the harbor, the way he'd said her name like it meant something sacred. Had that all been real, or had she been naive enough to believe she could be more than a distraction in his life? By midnight, she gave up trying to sleep. She walked to the window and looked down at the street. The world below went on, indifferent. Cars passed, lights flickered, people laughed somewhere far away. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd misunderstood everything. Maybe he hadn't chosen her heart over his world. Maybe he'd only let himself drift toward her until it was inconvenient. The next morning, the office was buzzing again. News outlets ran interviews with Gavin Hale, praising his graceful collaboration with both Stonebridge and Vale. Emily avoided eye contact with everyone. She moved like a shadow, efficient and invisible, the way she'd been before all of this began. Late in the day, she overheard Helen on the phone outside the conference room. Yes, the board's concerned. If this rumor keeps spreading, it could cost us the Hale deal entirely. Emily turned away, her throat tightening. When she looked up, Ethan was standing by the glass wall, watching her. His expression was unreadable, something between exhaustion and apology. For a moment, their eyes locked. The silence between them was too full of what neither dared say. Then he looked away first. That night, she left early. She couldn't bear another hour inside those walls. As she stepped outside, the wind caught her hair, the city lights gleaming against the rain-soaked pavement. She stood there for a long time, letting the noise fade into a blur. She'd given him her faith, her quiet, steady heart, and now she realized she might never have truly known him. Across town, in a private lounge, Gavin Hale raised a glass and smiled faintly. He's losing control, he murmured to Madison, who sat across from him, elegant and unbothered. Madison twirled her glass of wine, her lips curving slightly. He always does when emotion's involved. Gavin leaned back. Then let's make sure emotion stays exactly where we want it. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Don't worry. I know how to keep Ethan distracted. Meanwhile, high above the city, Ethan sat in his darkened office, the photo on his screen catching the reflection of his tired eyes. He closed it, turned off the lights, but even in the dark, her face stayed with him, the look she'd given him when he asked if she was all right. He hadn't answered the question she hadn't asked, and now he wasn't sure he ever could. It was late when Emily found herself back at Stonebridge Tower. The building loomed against the night sky, its glass and steel shimmering in the city's restless light. She hadn't planned to come back, not after everything, but some things refused to end in silence. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was nearly empty, her footsteps echoing faintly across the marble floor. Her heart was heavy, but her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Lucas Reed had made sure of that. Hours earlier, she'd met him by chance at a quiet cafe on Fifth Avenue. He'd been Ethan's closest friend since college, steady, grounded, the kind of man who saw through walls people built around themselves. He'd noticed her before she'd noticed him. offering that knowing half smile. "You look like someone who's been carrying someone else's burden," he said gently. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. When she finally told him what had happened about the rumors, the silence, the photo, the heartbreak, Lucas had listened without interruption. Then, quietly, he'd said, "You think Ethan doesn't love you because he hasn't fought for you. But that's not the truth. Emily, he hasn't fought because he's afraid." She looked up, startled. "Afraid Ethan Stonebridge?" Lucas nodded. "He spent his whole life being the man everyone needed him to be. The son, the leader, the name on the building. You're the first person who ever asked him to just be Ethan. That terrifies him." Her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Ask him what he's really afraid of. And if he can't answer, walk away knowing you were the only one who ever tried to make him see it." Those words had stayed with her, echoing through the evening, until they led her back here to the man who'd stolen her calm without meaning to. Now. As she rode the elevator to the top floor, the hum of the machinery matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. When the doors slid open, she found Ethan standing by his desk, the skyline glowing behind him like a ghost. Papers were scattered across the table, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside two untouched glasses. He looked up, surprised. "Emily." She stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." He hesitated, then nodded, motioning toward the chair across from him. But she didn't sit. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone cautious, weary. "Because I can't keep wondering," she said softly. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." He rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw tight. "Emily, this isn't a good time." She shook her head. "It never is." Her words hung in the air, sharp and steady. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the city beyond the glass. Then she took a breath, gathering the courage that had been building in her since the day everything fell apart. "If you want to end this, if you've decided it's easier to let me go, then say it. Say I'm not worth fighting for." Ethan's eyes flickered, startled. "That's not fair. Neither is silence," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You've built your life around control, Ethan. You don't take risks unless you can predict the outcome. But love doesn't work like that. You can't protect it by hiding it." He stared at her, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. "You think this is about control? I'm trying to protect what we built, both of us. The company, the people who depend on it. And what about me?" she cut in, her tone trembling with restrained pain. "Where do I fit in that equation? Am I just collateral damage?" His shoulders dropped. "You think I don't care? I think you're scared," she said quietly. "Scared that loving me makes you human. Scared that being human makes you weak." Her words hit him harder than she expected. He looked away, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't know what it's like," he said finally, his voice low. "To have everything you've worked for hanging on, how the world perceives you. One wrong move, one rumor, and it all collapses." Emily stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, then let it collapse. "At least it'll be real?" He froze, as if she'd spoken something he'd never allowed himself to hear before. For a long moment, they stood there, two people caught between truth and fear, between the world they built and the one they actually wanted. She swallowed hard, her voice softening. "Lucas told me something tonight. He said you're not trapped by circumstance. Ethan, you're trapped by fear." He exhaled, his breath uneven. He said that. She nodded. "And he's right. You're afraid of losing control, of disappointing people, of letting your name mean less than it does now. But you never stop to think that maybe, just maybe, being loved could mean more than any of it." Ethan didn't answer. He looked at her as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Emily's next words came out like a whisper, almost trembling. "I'm not asking you to choose me over your company. Ethan, I'm asking you to be honest with yourself, with me. If you're done, say it. Say I'm not enough. But don't hide behind duty. Don't call fear responsibility. He stepped toward her then, slowly, as if each movement took everything he had. Emily. She met his gaze, unflinching. Say it. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them stretched thin, fragile, alive. After a long moment, he whispered, I can't. Her breath caught. I can't say that, he said again, his voice breaking, because it's not true. The air seemed to shift. For the first time in weeks, his eyes softened not the cold, guarded look of a man protecting his empire, but the raw, unfiltered gaze of someone finally admitting he'd lost control. I love you, he said quietly, but I don't know how to love you without breaking everything else. Emily's eyes filled, but she didn't move. Then maybe breaking is the only way through. The words hung there, delicate and powerful. He looked down, almost trembling, his mask slipping. I don't deserve you. She shook her head, tears shining but steady. Then fight for me. Because if you don't, it won't be me you lose, it'll be yourself. For a long, breathless moment, neither spoke. The city lights pulsed against the glass like a heartbeat, the sound of rain beginning to fall against the window. Then, softly, she turned to leave. Her voice, barely above a whisper, lingered in the quiet. If you're going to let fear decide for you, Ethan, then at least have the courage to admit it. And with that, she walked out, her reflection fading from the glass as the door closed behind her. Ethan stayed frozen, her words echoing in the silence sharp, unwavering, true. He finally sat down, his hands covering his face, the sound of rain filling the room. Outside, the city kept breathing, but inside that office, something inside him had shifted quietly, irrevocably. For the first time, Ethan Stonebridge realized that all the walls he'd built to protect himself weren't keeping the world out. They were keeping him in. The morning light cut through the glass walls of Stonebridge Tower, soft but unyielding. It fell across Ethan's desk, scattering over papers he hadn't read and decisions he'd avoided for too long. He hadn't slept. Not really. He'd spent the night staring at the city he ruled and realizing what it had cost him. Emily's words still echoed in his mind. If you're going to let fear decide for you, then at least have the courage to admit it. He had. He'd admitted it to himself, to the silence, to the reflection of a man who'd built an empire but lost his own heart in the process. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, the kind that comes right before everything changes. Downstairs, the boardroom was already filling, the quarterly meeting, the one that would decide the next chapter of Stonebridge Corporation. Margaret Stonebridge was there, poised and polished, a portrait of power and pearls. The directors murmured among themselves, some worried, some watchful, all unaware that today wasn't about numbers. Ethan straightened his tie, then loosened it again. Enough masks, enough pretending. When he entered, the room fell silent. He looked around slowly, at faces that had defined his world for so long, and realized they no longer intimidated him. Let's begin, he said quietly. The meeting started as expected reports, projections, talk of damage control after the recent rumors. Gavin Hale's name came up more than once. Madison's too. He listened without interrupting, fingers tapping lightly on the table. Then, when the conversation shifted to him, his leadership, his personal life, he stood. I appreciate everyone's concern, he said evenly, but I won't be discussing my personal life any further. What I will discuss is the future of this company. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Ethan, he held up a hand. No, mother, not this time. The use of the word mother in this room, in that tone, sent a ripple through the table. Ethan turned to the rest of them. Stonebridge was built on integrity and strength, but somewhere along the way, we began confusing those words with control, with fear. We've allowed image to matter more than truth. Helen Drake shifted uncomfortably. Ethan, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, he said, his voice calm but steady. "I'm restructuring the board, effective immediately. Every member with a direct family or personal interest in the company holdings will step down." The room erupted. Questions, protests, half-shouted objections. Only his mother stayed silent, her gaze fixed on him sharp, assessing. "You're dismantling your own power base," she said finally. He met her eyes. "No, I'm reclaiming it." The words fell like a quiet thunder. When the meeting adjourned, the boardroom emptied in tense murmurs. Margaret lingered by the window, her back to him. "I thought I raised you to be stronger than this." He approached slowly, voice soft but firm. "You raised me to be in control. But control isn't strength. It's fear wearing a suit." She turned, her expression unreadable. "And this woman. Is she worth all this?" He smiled faintly, not out of defiance, but understanding. "She's not the reason I'm doing this. She's the reason I finally saw that I needed to." Margaret didn't answer. After a long silence, she said, "You'll regret it." He shook his head. "For once, I don't think I will." When she left, he stood alone, the city stretching endlessly below. The skyline had never looked so vast or so free. Later that evening, the sky over Manhattan turned to gold. Emily was still at her apartment, pacing, the weight of the last few weeks pressing heavy on her chest. She hadn't seen him since that night. She'd told herself she wouldn't go back, but some promises are easier made than kept. A knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, heart quickening. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, no suit jacket, no armor, just a man who looked both exhausted and alive. "Ethan." "I needed to see you," he said, voice low, raw. She didn't move. "Why are you here?" He took a breath. "Because I've spent my life protecting things that never loved me back. My family name, my reputation, my company. But you," his voice faltered, then steadied. "You make me want to fight for something real." She looked at him, searching for the hesitation that always lingered behind his words, but there was none. "I thought I had to choose between you and everything else," he continued, "but I realized everything else isn't worth anything if I lose you." Her throat tightened. "Ethan." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Emily, you are the only thing that's ever made me want to be a better man. You are the reason I can finally breathe." Her eyes filled, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not just saying this because you lost control of the board." He smiled softly, shaking his head. "No. I changed the board because I wanted control of my life. This," he reached for her hand, "this is what I want." Silence hung between them, trembling, fragile, alive. Then, with a breath that felt like surrender and promise all at once, he said it. "You are the one thing worth losing everything for." The air shifted. The city outside blurred into gold and shadow. Emily didn't speak. She just looked at him. The man who had once been untouchable, unshakable, and saw, for the first time, someone willing to be human. When he leaned forward, his forehead resting lightly against hers, she closed her eyes. No grand gesture, no music, just two people standing in the quiet, choosing each other over fear. Minutes passed before either spoke again. Ethan pulled back slightly, a faint smile on his lips. "I made a statement today," he said, "to the board, to the press." Her brows lifted. "What did you tell them? That I'm not renewing the family's controlling shares? That Stonebridge will become fully independent?" Her eyes widened. "Ethan, that's freedom," he said simply. "For the company, for me, for us." The room felt lighter somehow, as if the air itself had let go of something it had been holding too long. Emily's hand trembled slightly in his. "You really did it." He nodded, his smile softening. "For once, I didn't think about consequences. I just thought about what I couldn't live without." A quiet tear slipped down her cheek, and he caught it with his thumb. "You," he whispered, "outside, The first stars appeared above the city, tiny, flickering truths against the vast dark. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no need. The silence was full of everything they'd been too afraid to say. And then, softly, as if promising himself as much as her, Ethan murmured, "It's time I stop hiding behind what I built and start building something worth belonging to." Emily smiled through her tears. "Then let's build it together." He exhaled, the weight lifting, the storm finally quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a siren faded, and the city lights shimmered like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. In that small, still apartment high above Manhattan, Ethan Stonebridge finally chose not the empire, not the image, not the name. He chose love. The city stretched beneath them like a sea of light. Manhattan at dusk, soft, golden, and alive. From the rooftop of Stonebridge Tower, the wind carried the faint sound of traffic and music drifting up from the streets below. A year had passed since everything changed, since fear turned into truth, since control gave way to love. Emily stood near the edge, her hands resting on the glass railing, the skyline reflected in her eyes, endless and alive, behind her. The man who once lived only for that skyline now watched her instead. Ethan walked closer, quiet, his steps unhurried. He no longer carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, only the simplicity of being present. The company had survived the storm, the rumors had faded, the board had changed, and for the first time in its history, Stonebridge Corporation wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a place where people wanted to belong. Ethan often said the rebuilding wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was learning to live without the armor, to wake each day and choose honesty over image. And yet, standing here, watching Emily's hair move in the wind, he knew every risk had led him here. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her gaze still on the horizon. "The old version of your life." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes." But only for a moment. She turned to face him. "And then I remember what it cost me." She smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that always made him feel seen. "You found your balance?" she said. He shook his head gently. "No, I found my reason." The sun sank lower, painting the clouds in amber and rose. The glass towers around them glowed like gentle fire. Somewhere far below, the city continued its endless rhythm, people rushing, cars honking, lives colliding. But up here, time slowed. Ethan took a breath, as if gathering the courage not of a man making a decision, but of one about to speak from his heart. "Emily," he said, his voice almost carried away by the wind. She turned toward him fully now, her eyes curious, soft, alive with the kind of peace that only comes after surviving chaos. He stepped behind her, his hands finding hers, his chin resting lightly against her shoulder. Together, they looked out at the same world that had once demanded so much of him and now asked for nothing. "Do you know what I realized?" he whispered. "All this time, I thought freedom meant control, but it doesn't." She tilted her head slightly, listening. "Freedom," he said quietly, "is being able to love without fear." He fell silent for a moment. Then, with a breath that trembled just a little, he added, "Marry me." Emily froze, her lips parting in surprise. For a second, she didn't answer. The city, the wind, the heartbeat between them all held still. When she turned, her eyes were shining. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking into a laugh that sounded like relief. He smiled soft, human, completely unguarded. "I'm not asking because it's perfect," he said. "I'm asking because it's real." She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who once stood above the world and now stood open in front of her, vulnerable, certain. And she laughed again, quiet and warm, the sound wrapping around them like light. "This isn't an ending," she said. "It's a beginning." He nodded, his forehead resting against hers. "Then let's begin." The world below them glowed brighter as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, giving way to the soft blue of evening. The first stars appeared small, almost shy, yet certain in their light. For a while, neither spoke. They just stood there, arms around each other, listening to the hum of a city that no longer intimidated them. The glass beneath their feet reflected the fading colors of the sky, orange melting into violet, violet into night. The air was cool, the kind that carried promises rather than endings. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing her in the scent of her hair, the warmth of her presence, the quiet truth that had taken him so long to understand. He didn't think about shareholders, or headlines, or legacy. He thought about her hand in his, steady and sure, about the way she had once stood in his office, trembling but fearless, asking him to choose something true, and he finally had. Below them, the city kept moving, unaware. But up here, on this rooftop bathed in twilight, two lives had found stillness in each other. Emily leaned back against him, her fingers lacing through his. "You know," she said softly, "we didn't save each other." He smiled against her hair. "No," she shook her head. "We just stopped running." The wind stirred again, lifting the hem of her dress, carrying her words out into the open air. For a moment, everything felt infinite, the light, the love, the silence that no longer hurt. When the city lights flickered on, one by one, Ethan tightened his arms around her. Neither of them moved. There was no need, because some endings aren't meant to close a story. They're meant to remind you that love, when it's real, doesn't complete you. It frees you. And as the last glow of sunset faded into night, Emily looked up at him with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. Somewhere deep inside that stillness, the past finally exhaled, and the future began to breathe. Sometimes, life teaches us that love is not about perfection, it's about courage. Ethan and Emily's story reminds us that true connection begins when we dare to be honest, not when everything around us looks flawless. We all carry fears of judgment, of loss, of not being enough, and sometimes those fears build walls higher than any city tower. But walls can't protect the heart. They only keep it lonely. As we grow older, we learn that the real strength in love lies in gentleness, in saying I was wrong, in choosing kindness over pride, in allowing ourselves to be seen just as we are. Ethan's greatest victory wasn't saving his empire, it was learning to stand without the armor, to choose love even when it asked him to risk everything. Perhaps that's what life keeps trying to teach us, that freedom isn't found in control, but in trust, and that the most beautiful kind of love doesn't complete us. It frees us to become who we were meant to be. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending your time with Shining Stories tonight. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing gentle, heartfelt stories about love, courage, and the beauty of being human. Stay with us. There are many more stories waiting to shine their light into your heart.